Hello, world, and welcome back to TartleCast. We are joined today by a very special guest, and we're excited to have her on, Linda Powell. Um, if you haven't been directly in the world of finance, but maybe you're a U.S. citizen, she has some influence over your life, and you may have not realized it. Uh, Linda has sat on the board of the Federal Reserve as one of the chiefs for economic data management analysis for over 20
So can
years,
I interrupt you?
and then that transition.
Okay.
Yeah,
I was
go
not
for
on
it,
the
please.
board of the Federal Reserve. That's a very different. I worked at the
The
Board
board of
of
the Federal Reserve.
Governors of the Federal Reserve.
Correct. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, we got to get
Okay.
it right. And then that transitioned over to the Office of Financial Research. And then from that to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and then most recently Citibank. And there seems to be a recurring theme in the progression of your career around data analytics and how that really affects people in terms of their rights, financial rights, and making sure that access gets to those who, need that access. So I'd love if you could kind of, run us through to talk about how is it, with your perspective around data over the course of your professional career, how has it been viewed as an asset? Has that really evolved over time?
Absolutely. So if you think about the basic definition of an asset, it's something of value. If you think about the economic or the accounting definition of a value, it's something that has a perceived economic value. And I think if you think about the difference between those two definitions, describes how data has evolved as an asset. People have always known it's important, I need it, it's valuable, but we didn't always know that it had actual economic value and could help us
Mm,
in either, when I worked for the government, it was the data helped us perform our mission better. Now in the private sector, it's the data helps us earn more money. So it has moved
right.
from being considered just something of value to something of more of an accounting value.
So, Linda, when we think about that value, who then either owns that value or shares in that value? Someone says, "Okay, this is an asset." Well, then how do you then coin the ownership of that asset? The asset has to be tied to someone through some sort of deed or whatever that might be. So, how do we look at how that value then extends from this thing itself,
So
which is data?
when you think about assets, data's definitely a corporate asset. People are a corporate
Hmm.
asset. Money is a corporate asset. Who owns each of those? I'm a corporate asset for the company that I'm working for. They don't own me, but they own my time. When you think about data as an
Interesting.
asset, there can be lots of different owners. If I'm purchasing data from Bloomberg, it's a Bloomberg asset. They may own the rights to it, but I've purchased the essentially, the time. If it were a person, I would be purchasing its time to be able to use it. So it's hard to know who owns data. I have historically been quite adamant about not using, an individual as an owner of data. Generally, whoever creates the data, I would consider to be the owner of the data. So when it's a
Right.
vendor, they're often curating, doing quality assurance on a data asset, and then they sell it. For a bank, it's the data that they produce and create is theirs. For the government, it's the data that they produce and curate. They technically own.
Yeah, that's really interesting now because when that comes into a decision making process, okay, I have gone to go source something from the person who's creating it. They've generated this asset through their
Mhm.
time and work. We would like to capture that. And then from that data that we've captured, by offering them, some sort of value in return for it, we come to make a decision with that. Has decision making evolved around data in the finance world, from government to private sector, from what you've seen for how the decisions are made? Is it 100% data driven now? Oh, and in the past it was only like 20% data driven, and then 80% kind of like let's just gut check or like kind of do what we can. How have you seen that evolve?
So, there's definitely an evolution of how data has been used, which I think is what you're actually getting at. And
Right.
early on, data was used for generating reports. People needed financial reports, they needed regulatory reports. They used data to create reports so that they could do the analysis on it. Now, what we're seeing is people are programming parts of the analysis. And that's the artificial intelligence or the machine learning or any of the other type of analytics that you want to talk about. So if I can think of a process, my thought process, and how I want to evaluate whether or not I should make a loan to somebody or whether or not I should make a business investment, there's a lot of different steps I, as a human being, would go through to do that. And that's now being coded and codified through the analytics process. I like to think about how, if you've been working with someone for a long time and you're like, wow, they have a great business sense and they make all these great gut decisions. Well, someone who's been working in a business sector for a long time knows a lot about it and they have a lot of data points in their head, and they may not realize that they're going through and they're analyzing each of their data points when they say, well, I have a gut feeling that we should do X or Y.
Mm.
But people who do make really good business decisions are doing those analytics in their head. If we can spell out how are you doing those analytics, we can do it faster and more broadly with the computers and the analytics software.
That makes sense. When you have sort of like regime changes or maybe talent within very physically manufacturing driven places where the elders leave to retire, they typically
Mm-hmm.
carry the knowledge with them. And this is a big problem because then the rest of the factory is like, well, I don't know how they did their processes. Right. And so you're always finding yourself back at square one. So what you're saying is that, finance in the finance sector is really evolved to the point of let's capture these processes of knowledge, put it into essentially an analytical model. And as that the data goes in, like
Mm-hmm.
any human being like you and I would have been receiving, and someone might perceive as a gut check, is really just being computed on in the same format that the individual was doing. We've just done it more efficiently and we don't lose that
Yeah, that's
knowledge. Is that
part
what
of
you're
it. And
saying?
it's not just finance. It's throughout, industry. It's if you think about almost any product you buy, Amazon does this probably more than anyone else. Is they're constantly looking at what sells well, how to improve efficiencies, and it's rather than having a human being thinking about it, it's you can get it faster and more robust running it through a computer.
And that makes sense. And then now here's the next question then I would ask. People love to point fingers at Wall Street and bankers and all this other stuff because they lack an understanding of the process of these algorithms and what is actually going on. It doesn't have much transparency. And there is great value, technological value on Wall Street. If you're trying to find that arbitrage opportunity, it typically happens with information or your ability to process information differently. How do you see standards within the industry itself changing so that there's more transparency in financial markets to talk about these processes? And do you see that as something that decreases the ability for these arbitrage opportunities to happen for people to get gains beyond the normal? Or do you find that as something that will still afford for that opportunity, but brings the public more into the process of what is actually going
So,
on?
I have historically been a very big advocate of data standards. And if you look at the
Hmm.
retail industry and companies like GS1, who were one of the original barcode companies, um,
Barcodes.
they they don't just have good data standards, they have great metadata standards. And metadata is the data about your data, it describes it. Just in case
Right.
you have viewers that aren't aware, I think of data as a can of soup. And the can is the database that holds the data. The soup is the actual data. And the label that tells you how many calories it is and how many carbs it is and if there's salt in it, that's the metadata. So if you've got really good metadata, you can do amazing things with your data or with understanding about exactly where things are. I don't have an item that I've purchased
Can of soup.
handy, but if I had a can of soda in front of me, I would tell you that they could not just tell me how much the can of soda costs and what's in the can of soda, but where was it manufactured? All of that is built into the metadata for it. The reason retail got involved in that and started doing it early on is their margins are very, very small. I don't remember exactly what it is, but on a can of peas, the margins are like pennies. So they've got to have really good
Correct.
information. Historically, in finance, the margins have been huge. So if some transactions failed, it wasn't the end of the day. What we've seen, especially since the financial crisis, is that margins in the financial industry are shrinking. If you look at when interest rates are so low, there isn't a lot of room for margin. So we have to be more efficient. So I think that's why I'm seeing the financial industry is more interested in data standards than I've seen historically, is because it will help the financial industry. You asked about arbitrage, and I think there will always be opportunities for arbitrage, but hopefully the margins
Mm.
get smaller and smaller and smaller. The more transparency there is in the market, the less room there is for arbitrage. But I don't think you'll ever completely eliminate the opportunities
Remove
for
it.
arbitrage because timing is a great opportunity.
Now, the timing is always the best opportunity, especially with good information. So this information becomes more abundant. It becomes more decentralized about the people that have the ability to access it, or I guess more democratic in whatever sense you want to call it. Do you think that there will be a larger play in the retail market, essentially like the can of peas, where now the individuals have more metadata? All these cans of peas can come together and be like, oh, interesting. If we work collectively, we can actually be more efficient in our process of how we deal with financial markets or maneuver that to when it was something that was very, it was very commercial. It was very institutionalized. It was very black box. Do you see like that shift? It will continue to occur, or will there be probably a lot of friction between the institutions and the very, democratic, decentralized processes of finance we're seeing now?
So I'm going to say I'm optimistic that the benefits of data standards will be observed by the institutions. I can say I'll tell you a little story about right after the financial crisis, and I was working at the Federal Reserve,
Please, yeah.
and we realized, we at the Fed did not have all the data that we needed. We were able to get through the financial crisis, but we also saw that the financial institutions didn't have all of the data that they needed to be able to really deal with the financial crisis. And so we got all of the major financial regulators together. We talked to people in industry and we tried to figure out what were the top structural problems in the financial industry. And there were several. We talked about metadata and we talked about financial instruments and financial instrument identification. And there's players in that realm. So that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem that we identified was being able to uniquely identify institutions. So if you
Mm.
think about, I'm Linda Powell, there's a lot of Linda Powells. But the IRS never has any trouble finding me because I have a unique, persistent Social Security identifier. Um,
Right.
There are, I don't remember the numbers, but at one point there was about 14 completely independent city national banks in the US. And there was over 100 that had a name that was some derivative of that. So if you're trying to find out what's my position with City National Bank, the first thing you have to do is figure out which City National Bank am I dealing with, and addresses are not always the best way to do it. So there was, when Lehman failed, Wall Street pretty much held its breath for about 48 hours while transactions settled, because nobody knew who all of the subsidiaries of Lehman were, and they didn't know how to uniquely
It was that much of a
identify them.
guess game? There was no way to clearly identify,
There was
like,
no
anybody that
quick,
sat under the
easy way to
umbrella?
clearly identify them, because there was no unique,
Interesting.
persistent identifier that covered all of the financial
Wow.
institutions. So as a result of that, what we did is a bunch of the financial regulators got together, and we created, or we as regulators often do, we wrote a paper,
Yeah.
the linchpin paper, and we identified, what do you need to do to have unique, persistent identification of financial institutions. It became an ISO standard within a couple of years, and it's now an international ISO standard. And I can tell you, most of the big banks, I think, have adopted it and have LEIs for all of their subsidiary institutions. So it's a first step in being able to identify, like, yes, I'm dealing with the exact right institution.
Mm. Do you know, it reminds me of like counterfeit handbags. If I don't know the factory it was made from, I really don't
Yep,
know what I'm dealing with, right? Is this the skin of an
yep.
animal or a human? You know, frankly, I don't
That's a
know.
disturbing thought,
And
but
I know no, yeah, yeah. Well, there are people in history.
There's probably
So
a Netflix show on that.
yeah, but when I consider that, technologies, and I don't like using buzzwords, but like technologies such
yeah.
as blockchain afford for having that
Hmm.
unique identifier and applying it
Hmm.
distributedly across these models. So not one sovereign person or nation is responsible for it, but everybody as the collective becomes responsible for these unique identifiers for the banks. Are they thinking about applying that to this sort of linchpin policy?
Um, I'll be honest, I'm not sure. And I'm not a blockchain expert, but my understanding is the
That's
benefits
okay.
of blockchain are the security of it, that it's
Yes.
highly secure. Um, and so for things like a legal entity identifier, security is not your main issue. You really want this to be out there and identifiable. So it's really just getting people to register themselves, because there's a
Mm.
small cost to it. So of course nobody wants to spend the few $100s.
Small must mean
No,
enormous if it's
actually, I think per
if we're talking
institution, I think
finance.
it's, I don't know, I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, but it was, a couple $100s or something. Um,
Oh, come on, that's nothing. I thought we were talking
no,
about a big
no,
chunk of change here.
no,
Okay.
it's not particularly expensive for each individual company, but if you don't have to do it, why would you do it? But the benefit to it is, if you've got an LEI, and somebody has verified that you're really the institution that you say you are, then I know who you are. I don't have to do any more due diligence. I know who I'm working with. I know who I'm dealing with, and I can verify that you're the institution I
Right.
actually really was looking for. It's just like a social security number.
Mm.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
want to ask a fun question. I think this would be interesting. A lot of Americans have a view, because you work for over 20 years at the Federal Reserve. They either have like a nefarious or negative, neutral view,
Yeah.
I think, of the Federal Reserve. What is your, like, being an insider, what is the culture like there? Like what could you tell Americans on that? Like with you. I mean, you went through 2009 and
Yeah.
the financial crisis.
So I
How
can
is it
tell
there?
you that I loved my time at the Federal Reserve. That's why I stayed there so long. I get people asking me all the time, like, oh, I've been offered a job at the Fed. Should I take it? And I'm like, yes, absolutely. Probably the smartest people I will ever work with, I worked with at the Fed. There were some so brilliant people. I didn't always agree with everybody on every topic, but it's actually a very efficient organization. And my observation was it was incredibly data driven, and they were searching for the right answer. I was there I was there for a long time, so it was under a lot of different presidents, and there was lots of different pressures to do different things. And my observation was that the Fed really did work independently and sought the right answer. Was it always the right answer? Probably not. But it wasn't a nefarious situation. There was.
How was it during the
Um,
financial crisis?
it
I mean, that
was
had to
really
just been
busy. It was
horrific.
really very busy.
Yeah.
And I look at myself being in data as the like the medic. I was not on the front line. There were people who were there. They just didn't go home. They were there. They were working hard. They were really uh, interested in saving the economy. I was the medic who, once once the wounding was happening and people were like, "Hey, I need to find out this piece of information," and then we would figure out how to cobble some stuff together, or look at things in a different way, or produce some different sets of information. So it was absolutely fascinating. It was riveting to see the way that people looked at different situations, um, and it was a fascinating time. I would suggest to anybody go back and look at a bunch of the white papers that were written right after the financial crisis, because some of them were just brilliant pieces of work. It looked at it looked at what were some of the causes, and looked for proof of what were some of the different causes. So it was very fun.
And so if you're a doctor of finance, like let's say like a legitimate surgeon, and you are doing this triaging, and you have this data here in front of you, and you said, okay, 3 of these cases of us have died in front of us. One, for instance, Lehman Brothers. Okay, consider it a human being. We're going to capture all this data that caused whatever this negative occurrence was. Now, that data that was learned from these white papers, have you seen that triaging, that sort of that medical personnel within finance come in, share that knowledge, and has it been readily adopted by other institutions so that mistakes are learned from by using that data and using the metadata explaining it so that the same processes don't get repeated again?
I can't speak universally, but I've seen individual instances of that. So Lehman was about liquidity. Um, they were a fine company. It was all about liquidity. Um, and so and in banking, it's often about liquidity. It's capital, assets management, equity, and liquidity. And liquidity is you've just got to have enough money at the right time. So yeah, I've seen, I think it's pretty common knowledge that most of the big banks are investing a lot of money in their data management infrastructure so that they get good, accurate reporting on exactly where do they stand. You can't wait till the end of the month to know exactly what your stance is on a lot of your positions. So you have to have faster, more accurate data on a flow. And so I think a lot of the banks are investing. I know a couple of the really large investment banks spend millions of dollars right after the financial crisis, probably multiple millions of dollars to improve their metadata. because they didn't have the good enough metadata to know exactly where they were, and they learned from the Lehman example, and some of our largest financial institutions took it to heart.
Well, and that really is pleasant to hear, because when markets become fragile and economies do collapse, there are negative consequences, very physical ones, for
Oh
people's
yeah.
livelihoods. People end up dying, medical care doesn't happen, food supply, all those things. So when banks begin to adopt these data technologies, and even simple ones that you speak of, just having an identification number, this drives us towards a less fragile economy that can actually deal with many ebb and flows and mistakes that may occur, that would prevent more, how would I call it, disproportionate effects that could be negative to the people that are supporting that industry as a whole. And that would be, for instance, the United States. And I understand our, GDP in the United States, we're really a service country. We do financial services. That's a majority of the US's income. I think 70% of it. And if we look at that, then we need to continue to focus on building resiliency in this thing that supports our economy as a whole. And many other countries are very reliant on our banking. So I'm very hopeful for data to come in and solve many of these issues of fragility, lack of insight, lack of transparency, so that we don't, essentially continue to repeat the same mistakes.
Well, it's important for the individual banks, obviously, because they want to be happy and healthy and productive and make more money. And although nobody likes to be regulated, that is the primary purpose of the banking regulators, is to ensure safety and soundness. Because if a bank fails, it comes out of the taxpayer dollars. And none of the banks like being regulated. I don't like being regulated. I don't know anybody who does. But the primary goal of the regulation is to ensure that you're doing what you need to do, not just to make the most money that you can, but to ensure that you're safe and sound. And the reason that there's so much regulation on banking is because essentially all banks have free insurance. The government pays for their insurance if they fail through the FDIC. So there's lots of industry complaining about regulators, and but the bottom line is that the regulators are trying to ensure that institutions are safe and sound. And so one of my main mantras in the private sector has been, we don't do something because a regulator tells us we have to do it. We look at, why is the regulator telling us we have to do it, and figure out, how does that improve our business? Because if a regulator comes in and says, you need to clean up your data quality, it's in my best interest to clean up my data quality, because it will help me make better business decisions. It will help me know my position better. It will improve efficiencies because people will spend less time cleaning up data. So my biggest ask of industry in general is to not do things because regulators say they have to do it, but that they do it because that's what's best for their organization.
Yeah, Linda, you said you're into data standards and being a data standard advocate. What are some of the things that you see that private industry could work on as far as data standards goes?
So I think, and you see it in all industries until they realize that there's sort of a tipping point, is if you think about it as an individual, if I told you to keep a database of all the people that you do interviews with, you would probably assign each of us a unique identifier. It is so much easier for you to just make up your own unique identifier for everybody that you've interviewed than it would be to go out and find, some standardized identifier of all of the people and then apply that. But if you want to take your data and integrate it with something else, then your unique identifier is worthless. And if you had used a standardized unique identifier, it would make the integration of data
A world of difference.
imminently easy. Um, The hard part is getting people to move from, I have a task I have to do, and I want to do it in the easiest, most efficient way for me, to, I have a task I have to do. I want to make sure that whoever's using this data can use it in the most efficient way. Even if it's harder for me up front, I want the use to be as efficient as possible. And that's a big shift. And it's not a shift that comes natural to human beings. It's because we're all trying to do our own work as fast as we can. It's taking the larger view of things of how do I make things more efficient for the entire ecosystem so that we can do things that we currently can't do at all.
So if I think then about data strategy, it sounds like an educative process that needs to happen on the perspective of how
Mm-hmm.
we do work and
Yep.
analyze our work. So is that the approach you take in your professional career, is really an educational approach that is much more proactive than this supposed efficiency approach that can be quite reactive and
Absolutely.
inflexible?
I think the role of any executive data professional is, you've got one foot in the business and one foot in technology, and the business side has to be doing the education about what if. There was one organization when I joined it as the CDO, and I came in and we were there was a number of things we couldn't do. And it took probably 2 weeks for people to just find out what data did they have available to them when they wanted to start a project. And that's because we didn't have a data catalog. It's sort of the first, data 101 is, if you don't know what you have, you can't manage it. So we had to create a data catalog. And rather than explaining about metadata and how you would integrate things, what I did was I talked to them about what if. What if you were starting a project, and rather than having to take 2 weeks to determine what data you had and whether or not it was suitable and calling 30 people and trying to get a sample of it, what if within 30 seconds you could know what data are available to you? And what if within a minute you could see a sample of that data? And what if within 2 minutes you would know exactly who you needed to call or what you needed to do to be able to get access to it to use it? So it was more the what if you could go from 2 weeks before you could even start a project to under 2 minutes to be able to start your project. So that's sort of the sales part of a data job is what does your business need, and how can your data and managing your data and integrating your data help you. One of my other favorite examples of data integration, and I got the idea for this after a lunch with an economist, and they were saying how first thing they did on every project was they had to take, data from Moody's and Standard & Poor's and the SEC and a bunch of other data and figure out which companies they were going to look at, and then tie all of the identifiers together. Well, everybody who needs to look at a bunch of different databases needs to do that. Why not do it once centrally? So we created an integration database where it took all of the vendor data and the vendor's unique identifiers, and then all of the government unique identifiers, and eventually the LEI, the legal entity identifier. And that way you could take all of the stock prices, all of the bond prices, all of the financial statement information, and you didn't have to spend 2 weeks merging all the data together. You could do it instantly because somebody else had already done that, and it was reusable. It was a reusable resource that everybody in the organization got to use.
And what was the benefit of centralizing something like that? It reminds me a lot of the NSA's X key score, where let's centralize just about everything happening on the internet. So we can go into this database and look up people, for instance, and what they're connected to with their unique identifier. Was there a benefit to this sort of
Absolutely.
centralization?
One is the economies of scale. Is rather than every time somebody wants to do a project, you have your research assistant go spend a month doing it and then throw it away. Rather than recreating the wheel constantly, you were just capturing it. And it was also rather than having dozens of research assistants working on dozens of different projects, we had two people who worked on it part time, and we developed different algorithms to do the initial matchings. And as people had time, they would go and do more of the manual types of matchings that we couldn't get through the algorithms that we evolved. So we had economies of scale because we had more people thinking about it, and we didn't have to have it freed up resources throughout the rest of the organization. And it was also there ready and waiting for you when you needed it. Now, one of the things that I'm most proud of is we had that database up and running and nearly fully complete before the financial crisis. And that database, that was a time when we didn't have 2 weeks to merge all the data together. We had hours, if that. So that database got hit very heavily, the integration database during that time. So one, it saves resources. Two, you get economies of scales. And three, it's ready for you when you need it.
Yeah, I like that. It's, you know, having that confluence of the minds or the congregation of minds come together on a pool of resources or truthful information affords for quicker decision making. And I think that's a very smart approach. And when you can take very decentralized
Mhm.
data generators, whether it be people or Moody's or whatever it might be, and you can bring them together to share across one specific pipe, there's great benefit that happens there. And I don't think it's necessarily so centralized as you think it is. I really think it's like a bridge that's tied all this together. And yes, it does look like a hub and spoke, but it's the fact that we could stitch everybody together and bring them into
Yeah.
one medium. And I don't think it's centralization in the fact that it's a central authority, but I think it's a central receptacle of understanding where people can go to it and learn from that center, like going to a
There
university.
are, and I'm not as involved with them personally, but there are more software applications now that help you do that kind of tying things together and integration that didn't exist back during the last financial crisis. But there are ways where you don't have to have it all quite centralized anymore. You can do more of a hub and spoke now, but I haven't worked with them quite as much.
So this podcast is going to go out to quite a few professionals, especially in your field, across the globe. Is there any really sound piece of advice that you've learned from your career that they could act upon right now within their organization, education, perspective driven, purpose, whatever that might be, that you'd want to share with them?
Sure. I'll say my observations in human nature is everybody wants to start with analytics. We're going to do some machine learning. We're going to get some artificial intelligence. We're going to get, some dashboards and some Tableau great dashboards where we can drill down through things. You can't get great analytics until you do your blocking and tackling. If you don't have your data in appropriate data stores, if you don't have good metadata, and if you don't have good security and privacy over your data, you're not going to get to good analytics. I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you go from food and water up to enlightenment. Well, having your appropriate technical environment is sort of your food and water. Having your metadata is your housing. And the higher up you go, I think about the analytics is what is it, love and friendship, and then enlightenment is
Yeah,
your
correct.
AI. But if you don't have the foundations of that pyramid in place. You can get to enlightenment, but you can't stay in enlightenment, and you can't go to scale because you're rebuilding it every single
I feel
time.
like, yeah, they all shoot for enlightenment. To me, it's like somebody taking drugs to see like the spiritual side of life when they should have just taken the time to meditate and get there, but they were looking for a shortcut. And when you find that shortcut, it leaves as quickly as it came. And so in the search for enlightenment, I love your sound advice of having the foundation in front of you, be objective about it, and just make your way through the steps properly so you have the foundation in place to make good decisions when it comes to new technology that may sound phenomenal with its AI and those algorithms. So I think definitely that will definitely be heard. It makes great sense. We share this a lot. You got to go
Yep.
back to the fundamentals. And having that right metadata will make all the difference. So, Linda, thank you again for joining us here on TartleCast. It's been a blast. Thank you for giving us a little insight into the Federal Reserve, its culture, your perspectives on business, and also where data strategy is headed in the future.
Great. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.